Hello, and welcome to our discussion on nuclear energy. You may be asking the question as to why include a discussion on nuclear energy in a class that is entitled or has the concept of renewable energy in it. But we also want to expose you to perhaps another consideration, which is the concept of alternative energy. We've mentioned that a few times previously in previous videos. And so now we're going to discuss the options of nuclear as an alternative to fossil fuels. And the reason why we feel like it's worthwhile to include that here is because renewable energies, as we will learn more and more about, tend to be very difficult to dispatch. Sometimes they're actually quantified as non-dispatchable resources. And that's primarily because there is no guaranteed supply, if you will. So the example there is if you have a gas turbine and you have a gas line that is coming into your facility, and that's a pretty reliably built line with a pretty well-established infrastructure that can provide a reasonable amount of gas for an extended period of time, then you have a very high confidence that that gas turbine is going to be able to produce energy, not because it's going to have a loss of fuel. Where with renewables, for example, solar or wind, that is highly dependent on the weather. So if it's a cloudy day or a very sunny day, the output from a PV array can be very different. Similarly, with the case where you have windy days or non-windy days with wind farms. And so it's really more difficult when you have to include the weather. And so it can make dispatching a very difficult process. And utilities or the transmission owners or transmission operators, they don't have the luxury of being able to state, we will just see what the weather looks like today, and then we'll decide about whether to dispatch this generation, the solar generation or wind generation on. They have to know that it's available because they have to have some forecasting ability and then some ability to tell generators we're going to probably need 200 megawatts, however many megawatts at a certain period of time. So they need to be able to provide or feed the load that is demanded. And so having non-dispatchable resources makes that a very difficult and very challenging approach. Where nuclear energy, you do have a fuel source, right? You have a reactor that is filled with nuclear fuel. And as long as it's a pretty well-maintained facility and if they're keeping up on changing up the fuel as necessary, then it's reasonable to assume that that generating facility is going to be able to provide the electricity to the grid as required. So that's primarily the reason why we're including nuclear energy in here. We're going to be honest and talk about the good things and the bad things. So we'll first get into some of the engineering aspects of it or the technology behind how a nuclear facility is laid out. We'll very briefly get into how energy is derived from nuclear because it gives you a little bit of an understanding of why spent fuel is so dangerous. We'll talk about current US technology, and I will be frank and say that the current reactor technology for almost all the reactors in the US is very, very old technology, but has shown very high reliability. So that's why nobody wants to replace it. Then we'll talk about next generation reactors or even sort of more up-to-date reactor technology and see some of the differences. We'll talk about some of the regulatory and permitting issues and why, particularly in the US, it is so difficult and expensive to get a nuclear facility constructed. We're going to talk about the downsides, which the major one is radioactive waste. And then we'll briefly discuss the future in terms of looking forward and going from there. So we've kind of gone through this a little bit already, but a renewable energy source is one that pretty much the energy comes from the sun. If you think of solar, it's pretty obvious. When you talk about wind energy, it's primarily because you're heating and cooling the Earth's surface at different levels. And because of the density changes, you actually have volumetric flow and then eventually a feeling of wind. And so those tend to be renewable. And realistically, those aren't even long-term renewable because the sun eventually will burn out, but that's billions of years from now. So that is pretty much anything that you can attribute its energy from the sun. Now we do have biomass, which is kind of one that I don't know if you would really consider that renewable. But certainly if you're using tree waste or something like that, that is considered a renewable resource because, again, the production of the wood or switchgrass or whatever is actually from the sun's energy. So that would be renewable, whereas alternative is anything that is different than fossil fuels. So renewable energies are alternative. Nuclear energy is alternative, but technically nuclear is not a renewable energy. It is only classified as an alternative energy source. And so this dispatching is very, very difficult to have that, grid that is mandated to have really reliable power on an as needed basis. So our transmission operators really have to predict what the supply is going to be based on not exactly knowing what the load is. And so the concept there is you may be at home and you might be deciding to run your dishwasher or your stove because you want to cook something, or you may not. And utility has no idea of knowing that. So they can't predict with 100% certainty what your load is going to be down to the second. And so they have to have some margin put in there. Now, if you can expand that over thousands or tens of thousands of different users, then you can see that that variability of the load makes it very, very difficult to ensure that you have sufficient supply. Well, when you don't know the supply and you don't know the load, or you don't know exactly what the supply and the load are going to be, then you have to build in much, much more margin. And the concept of spinning reserve is probably getting a little bit antiquated at this point, but it used to be that if you had a generator and it was, let's say it's a 100 megawatt rated generator, you might only run that at 70 or 80 megawatts. And the reason being is because the generator is spinning. And in the event that something happens on the grid where there's a big increase in demand for one reason or another, then you have some generation that is spinning. It is ready to go to be able to very rapidly pick up and support that load. And so that's the concept of spinning reserve, because the generators are already running. You don't have to wait hours perhaps to get those generators running. These generators can essentially put out what the power you need almost instantaneously. And so when you have big demands for spinning reserve, then the concept is you actually need to have you can't really have no more than 20% of the load be renewable, because if your if your load is 100 megawatts and you don't necessarily know what the supply is, you don't want that to be more than 20%, because now you have an additional 20% of spinning reserve for those dispatchable technologies. And one of the things I failed to mention is renewable doesn't necessarily always mean it's not dispatchable. For example, hydroelectric facilities, those tend to be pretty well dispatchable because you have a pretty good idea that you have water in your reservoirs. Now, if it's going to be months or so with very little rain, that can be more problematic, but you get the idea that there's just more of a short-term question in terms of dispatchability. So once we get into having some way of storing energy, it isn't the concept of fuel, it isn't the concept of that dam reservoir, or we could even include battery storage. If we have sufficient battery storage, then the idea changes dramatically, because now we have a backup in the event that the sun's not out or the wind's not blowing, or even a cloud comes over a fair portion of our PV farm. Then what we'll see is that we can have the battery pick things up. And so it can support more of the load when the renewable energy sources go out. And so now, as long as you have sufficient battery storage, you can start to push more and more of these renewables to actually maximize the resource that's available. And so battery storage has huge implications for improving the amount of renewable energy that actually non-dispatchable that can be operated. So nuclear is got a lot of benefits, right? Nuclear has very stable generation because it has a fuel source. And so you know how much energy is in the fuel. You can pretty well predict that that is going to be available to get some electricity out of. Also, the really interesting thing about a nuclear facility is that you are not burning anything. There is no combustion process at a nuclear power plant. It is done by splitting the atom, and you are, quote unquote, burning the fuel, or it is becoming spent fuel, but that's really a misnomer. You are not actually lighting anything on fire. So because you're not doing any transition from, wood to a process, there's no byproduct of CO2. So a nuclear facility has no CO2 production. If there is some CO2 production, it's because the concrete is decaying a little bit, and that might release some CO2. but it's very, very little CO2. And we'll look at some slides here in a moment that talk about the comparison of different technologies and how much CO2 they produce. And the other interesting thing is that typical nuclear facility releases less radiation than what you would find from a comparable coal plant. And that may or may not make sense to you, but a nuclear power plant, their job is to take fuel and generate heat and then thereby generate electricity, but they do it through the process of nuclear fission. And why that's so important is because that is the process of releasing radiation. And so these facilities are designed with the concept in mind that you have to contain the radiation that is released. So not only are you designing a steam plant that can convert thermal energy from a source to electricity, you are also designing a plant that is going to contain or capture as much of that radiation as possible. So the design is way different than a coal plant because a coal plant is just burning fuel. So they're worried about emissions, but they're not worried about the radioactive emissions. That's sort of the byproduct of the whole process. And so here is a slide that I was able to find that talks about CO2 production and coal being, the leader, if you will, of CO2 production. And then you go all the way down to almost negligible, and you can see wind and nuclear are essentially almost the same. Hydropower is higher than nuclear because you need more concrete. And again, this is very important because this is per kilowatt hour. So this is nameplate rating on a nameplate rating basis or per kilowatt hour basis. And so it's reasonable to go ahead and assume that you're comparing based on 1,000 megawatts to 1,000 megawatts, not one nuclear plant to a 1 megawatt solar farm. The other thing that is really interesting is if you look at the solar tends to be much, much higher. And the reason why it's so much higher is because you need massive amounts of semiconductor material, and the production of that semiconductor material into a PV array takes a tremendous amount of energy. So the production of the PV cells or the photovoltaic arrays is actually where you need this massive amount of CO2. Now, if you are going to be using alternative energies to go ahead and do that, you can get these down. But this is usually, sort of an average or baseline amount of fossil fuels. As we use more and more efficient or renewable resources, we can drop those a little bit. We're not really going to drop too much hydropower because, again, most of that is in the requirement of erecting dams and doing that type of stuff. Here's the amount of CO2 emissions that have been avoided. And again, this is difficult to find, but this is almost over a 40-year period. And you can see that this is gigatons of CO2 is the y-axis variable that you see here. And you can see the cumulative is over 60 gigatons of CO2. So that is the amount of emissions that have been avoided by using nuclear. And the US for many, many years was one of the leaders in terms of reducing the amount of CO2 as a result, because nuclear used to be very, very common and was a very big resource or source of electricity in the US. Now it's sort of stabilized, and unless some new plants get built, it's probably going to start decreasing. But the reality of it is the US has been a big player. We've talked about capacity factors in the past. We'll talk about them again. And the reason why nuclear plants are so effective from a cost perspective is the capacity factor. If you look at a nuclear power plant, its capacity factor is at the absolute peak. It is at 90% capacity factor, meaning that plant runs full out over the course of a year, 90% of the time. And that's partly because of the fact that it's very cheap to run a nuclear power plant, but also it has to do with the design and maintenance. And so nuclear power, when we have accidents at nuclear facilities, they can have catastrophic consequences. And so the amount of regulations and testing that are done at these nuclear facilities is extensive. And so as a result, you're not putting together, it's not like you're working in the backyard of your neighbor's garage and you're trying to figure out how to put together a car to make it run for a couple hours. This is something that has been designed, constructed, and maintained so they don't trip very often. So extremely, extremely high reliability. But with that being said, nuclear power plants, these are current generation nuclear power plants, aren't designed or were designed so that they can't ramp up and down in power very efficiently. They do very well of getting up to full power and staying there. That's where they like to be. If you were to try to ramp a nuclear power plant, a typical commercial nuclear power plant today, it would struggle with that. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be a struggle. If you think of nuclear submarines or aircraft carriers, they ramp up and down all the time. They're designed with a different reactor design so that they can ramp up and down and they don't have any issues. But at least from the commercial perspective, for today's reactors, that's the concept. Moving forward, if renewable or nuclear is going to be more part of the future, they're going to have to include that ability to ramp up and down their power output. So the capacity factors may change as a result of that. So now we're talking about different technologies and what we call the levelized cost of electricity, which we'll get into more. But essentially, what it boils down to is if you take all the costs associated with running a plant and then you were to interconnect that to the grid, these would be the typical costs of running the plant. And again, you have to take some of these things with a grain of salt because you can see this slide is from the NEA. But you can see nuclear is the lowest. And this is the case where it has long-term operation running for 40 years and has been relicensed. And so most nuclear power plants in the US have an initial operating license of 40 years, and then they can apply for license extensions. And so there's been a number of nuclear power plants in the US that have gone and had a license extension to extend their operating life to 60 years. And there's a couple in Virginia that have already gone through, they're almost at their 60-year license time, but they've actually applied for another relicensing. And so again, if you've maintained the facility really well, you've taken care of it, there's no reason to believe that that plant can't continue to run. So they're talking about 80 and perhaps even 100 years. And so if you look at running these for extended periods of time, you can see that the cost drops precipitously. Where if you compare it to the nuclear option, just to stand it without the relicensing, the costs go up quite a bit higher, but still fairly cost competitive. And then you can start to compare some of the more typical ones. You can see coal plants tend to be very economical, but coal plants are getting harder and harder to build because of the amount of emissions that are produced. Combustion cycle gas turbines tend to be very clean, easy to build, so they can be fairly cheap and somewhat competitive with nuclear. And then we start looking at some of the different renewable technologies, and there's a lot of variance there. And so you can get a sense of where the different technologies can compete on a dollars per megawatt basis. Here's something looking forward for the future a little bit, and this actually compares the different technologies that are dispatchable, and the concept here or the term here is clean. And so if these are clean technologies, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are, perfectly clean, but they would tend to produce very little CO2, that's the concept here. And so if you look at the cheapest ones, you can see that nuclear with lifetime extensions tend to be very, very low. And then if you start going into larger scale nuclear reactors, they may or may not have a lifetime extension. You're talking about, a doubling or even perhaps a quadrupling of the cost. Now you go to SMR, which is small modular reactors. These are the ones that, if you've been paying attention to the news, you have these very large data centers that use massive amounts of power for artificial intelligence processing and going along from there. They're talking about building these small modular reactors. And so those are going to be higher costs because they're designed not to be the most efficient, but they're designed to work for a number of applications. And so you can see that the prices go up a little bit there. And then we go to bioenergy. You can start to see, pretty big costs associated with that. And then the last one, the purple one we can see is a combined cycle gas turbine fitted with a carbon sequestration system. So basically capturing the carbon and then either burying it in the ground or going something like that. So you're talking more than double the cost of a nuclear power plant. Now we start to go to the non-dispatchables, which would be PV and onshore wind. And you can see that those actually have some opportunities, especially in 2040. This is not for today. This is in 2040. So quite a bit of time from now. But the idea here is that as we improve with the technologies and the siting, we actually can get the cost down. But you can see very low costs here. The difficulty, again, is these are non-dispatchables. And then the last one of these are the average costs for if you would include the generation as well as the grid interconnect costs that you would see. And those are assuming what it would be called renewable portfolio standards. So what are the current ones, and then what would be announced? So these are different organizations that have some interest in increasing the amount of renewables, which are going to drive the costs up. So I always am amazed at you can have a nuclear power plant that can run at 100% output for 2 years, never have any problems, never shut down, and nobody even hears about it. It's just doing its job, and it's doing it really well. So I, as an engineer, always ask the question, how did they design this? What magic did they do to make this facility run so well that it can run for 2 years? Because most cases that just doesn't exist. You've got to do maintenance, you got to do shutdowns, you got to check things, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in a nuclear power plant, you have not only the manufacturer of the reactor and the designer of all the steam systems. Usually there can be two separate ones, especially older designs. Like older designs, you might have had a GE plant, or you might have had a combustion engineering reactor, and then they might have had a different engineering of record that would have actually designed the non-nuclear side of the house. So this would be the boiler systems, not the boiler, but the steam turbines and the condensers and all that stuff to get the power out. So that might have been different. But all those, with that being said, you still have to have very, very high reliability. The US NRC, US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has been assigned the responsibility of making sure the commercial nuclear power plants are in fact safe. And they actually are responsible for more than that. They also sort of supervise or monitor what happens when you look at if you use radioactive material at a hospital, for example. So there are policies and procedures that are required by the NRC to make sure that those are safe. But if you were to go to the US NRC's website, you can see codes after codes after codes, and so much information. And all these utilities, or all these generating facilities, these nuclear generating facilities, are obligated to follow that. Now, you might be able to say, well, that's all well and good, but are they actually following it? Well, each of the nuclear reactors at their site has a NRC staff member on site at all times, attending meetings, making sure that they're following the Code of Federal Regulations for requirements that are specified. So that's just a very different thing than having an inspector coming in and periodically. You have an NRC person actually on site monitoring to make sure that things are going as they're supposed to. And there's constant checking and rechecking, as well as the staff are trained, because again, you don't want to have an accident that could negatively affect the public. So is just tremendous amount of effort to make sure that these plants are run extremely well with very high reliability. Let's take a look at a nuclear facility. So this is one of the things that I always find fascinating, because you'll see a nuclear facility has some of these pieces of equipment, but not necessarily all of them. So the first thing when you see a news report is you always sort of see these structures here. These are highlighted as, oh, this is definitely a nuclear power plant. Those actually have nothing to do with nuclear whatsoever. Those are cooling towers. They are natural circulation cooling towers. Those are older designs, meaning they basically act like a chimney. And so you would spray water down here on the bottom, and you get a drafting effect that would pull air into these cooling towers. And as the water is sprayed in, it is getting cooled by the ambient air. And so the hot air leaves. And so this is basically part of the condensing process. That is where you would actually have that. So you can have these. I was at a power plant in Arizona a few years ago, and they had a number of cooling towers. So this is really just if you need something cooled down and you don't want to use a mechanical process to do it, meaning you don't want to use a fan, you can use this natural process to do that. And so that's typically what you see in the news as a nuclear reactor. And you tend to see these at some nuclear reactors, and that's because they have so much heat that they produce that they really need a lot of cooling capability. And so they'll have very large cooling towers, but you don't necessarily have to have those there. They can use the smaller ones that perhaps are shown over here. You just would need a lot of them. And so the next thing you see is, wow, they've got two identical sort of facilities looking over here. Well, interestingly enough, this part right here, again, has nothing to do with nuclear. That's usually the turbine building. That's where the steam is going. And in pressurized water reactors, all the steam that goes in that building has no radioactive material whatsoever. So if you were to actually look at where the nuclear sort of stuff would be, it's in these sort of reinforced concrete buildings that are shown here. And in many cases, the amount of fuel that has been used over time is actually located in those reactors as well. So most nuclear reactors were designed with the ability to store their spent fuel because when they were built, they did not have a spent fuel repository. So they were obligated to store their fuel on site until a long-term repository was created. And so they've got these spent fuel pools and they keep re-racking them or keep doing different things to make more and more room. At some point, they're going to run out of room because, they didn't anticipate that it would take this long. But the amount of radioactive material is sequestered in those two rooms. And so this facility is probably 2,200 megawatts, and it's got massive amounts of buildings and different things. But you really don't need the majority of the stuff except for the fact that this is where the reactor is. And so that would be the equivalent of a nuclear reactor. You do see some turbine buildings, you see some different stuff, but you also see some large smokestacks here. That could be because you need a lot of backup power in some of the older plants, and so those would be from diesel generators typically, or even perhaps gas turbines. And so you would want to control emissions, and so you do that. And then everything around here is all support staff buildings to make sure that the facility is doing what it needs to do. It's being maintained and going from there. This is inside of a reactor, and this is the reactor design called a pressurized water reactor. For those of you who may or may not be aware, Maine Yankee, which is no longer exists, that was a nuclear facility that was in Wiscasset, Maine, or just outside of Wiscasset, Maine, and that was a pressurized water reactor, and it used the basic design elements shown here. So what you'll notice is this structure here. This is the containment structure. And in a pressurized water reactor, the biggest issue would be is that these pipes right here, these large pipes that go back and forth from inside this area to outside, this area here, the water that flows, or it's actually steam at this point, the steam that flows through there does not have radioactive material because these are large steam generators. But the concern would be if these pipes break for one reason or another, you now have very hot water that's, maybe 500 or 600 degrees water, or even steam perhaps, that immediately is in an environment that, let's say this is 2250 psi. Now it's essentially in an ambient environment. And so what happens is that expands very rapidly. So inside containment, the pressure gets really high. And so the whole thing about the design of a containment structure is if those pipes break, that the size of the containment structure and the strength involved with it, it has the ability to absorb all that, high pressure steam that has been flashed or done whatever, and it expands very rapidly, but that containment structure will not get damaged. And the one at Maine Yankee was designed to go all the way up to like 50 psig, which is quite high. And they had to test it. They tested it every, I don't know if it was 5 or 10 years. I don't recall quite how much, but they would actually pressurize the reactor to 50 psig, and they would verify that there was leaking less than a certain percent, so it would not get damaged or whatever. But that's the containment over here is just an overhead crane because you got to move heavy things in and out. So you use the crane for that. As I mentioned, these are steam generators. These over here are called reactor coolant pumps. Their job is to just circulate water inside the reactor. And then this over here is called a pressurizer, and its job is to make sure that the pressure in the reactor stays pretty consistent. This is the spent fuel pool where you would keep your spent fuel. And again, you have another crane overhead to move the fuel back and forth, and that has to be connected to the building. That all has to be done underwater because water is a very great container of radioactive material or radiation. Other things are not as good. So if you just keep it underwater, it's actually really easy to move fuel from one point to another. And over here would be the control room. It doesn't have to be directly adjacent to the containment building. It can be, but oftentimes it does not need to be. And then over here, you have some pressure relief valves. If for some reason you have a problem and you have all the steam and you can't send it to the generator, you got a lot of heat. So you have to just dump that to the environment to get it to cool down. And again, that's not a problem because in a pressurized water reactor, it's not contaminated. Those steam generators are which separate the primary, which is the primary source that actually does come into contact with the nuclear fuel, and the secondary, which is the water or the steam that goes over to the steam generators and the condenser. So there's a physical barrier between the two, so no radiation should get out and into that primary, that secondary material. So how do we get energy from splitting the atom, essentially? So an atom has protons, neutrons, and electrons. We all remember that from high school chemistry. Where we may or may not have gone into is this mass deficit. So the nucleus of an atom has less mass, interestingly enough, than the sum of the protons and the neutrons. So if you sum the mass of those two, that atom has a mass that is less than that. And where that comes into is what's called binding energy, keeping the neutrons and the protons in close proximity. And that energy is quite strong, and it makes up for that mass deficit, the difference between the two. So if you split an atom, we're not talking about fusion here, we're talking about fission, then you're going to release about 3.2 times 10 to the minus 11th joules, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you consider that as one atom, and if you consider how many trillions of atoms would be in nuclear fuel, you can see how quickly the energy gets added up. Now, if we could combine protons and neutrons into one nucleus, that's called the process of fusion, and that would be exactly the same process. So nuclear fission or nuclear fusion would be a way to go ahead and either split atoms or to combine and make atoms. The problem is that there's been no proof or no viable way that has been shown to do fusion at very low temperatures or moderate temperatures. We do have a nuclear fusion reactor that we see every day in the sky. It's called the sun. We get all kinds of energy because of the process of fusion. But the sun, millions and millions of degrees, not really practical to have on it. So how do you get the atom to release the binding energy? You split it. So you force a neutron from another location, you force it into the nucleus, and it splits and breaks the nucleus apart. And then that is where the energy is released. So why do we use uranium? Because uranium-235 is the only readily fissible material that has enough nuclear or neutrons to go ahead and continue the reaction. That is called a chain reaction. And so if you were to take a look at a figure, what we see is we have a neutron that's coming in here on the left. So this is a neutron. This here is the moderator, and the whole purpose of the moderator is actually to slow down the neutron, because if it was to go too fast through the material, it might have actually split the atom that's adjacent. And so that would be a problem. So it slows it down. It comes into contact with one uranium-235 atom, and then it splits it. And then as part of the splitting process, you got 1, 2, 3 neutrons available, and those are at high speed and high energy, and they're able to go ahead and split more atoms. And then that process repeats and repeats and repeats until there is basically only spent fuel. And again, that's called the chain reaction. So it will continue to do that until the spent fuel is gone, or you're absorbing all those neutrons. And if you see here at the end, you can see where the control rods are. Those are the purpose of those is to actually stop the chain reaction by absorbing any spent or spare neutrons. It doesn't absorb them all, but it absorbs enough of them that the power levels tend to be really low. And again, the splitting of the atom releases that binding energy, which goes into the moderator. In the US, that's clean water. And it's actually boronated water. That's part of the slowing down process. They use boron to slow down some of the uranium, the neutron from the uranium that has been broken apart. And then that process repeats. And this warmer water than energy, it's heated up. And then that's where we can get our energy to go ahead and actually start to create steam. So we talked about U-235. So it is the only known element that is readily visible in its state. We'll talk about thorium in a little bit, but what we'll see that U-235 is the perfect amount and the perfect material. 235 is the mass of the neutrons. It's a very dense atom. And interestingly enough, only 0.7% of the known uranium on Earth is U-235. So when we talk about alternative energy, we also want to make sure that there's enough fuel to last us a long period of time. Well, if we only have 0.7% of the known uranium is U-235, we don't have an unlimited supply, just like with fossil fuels. And so one of the things that is the research that is ongoing for nuclear to continue is how do we get more fuel, or do we use alternative fuel sources to go ahead and do that? Our chain reaction is controlled. We don't want all the energy to be released all at once. If all the energy is released all at once, you essentially have a nuclear bomb, and that is not controllable and doesn't do its job. So by controlling the chain reaction, you actually can control the amount of neutron bombardment, which means the number of atoms that are being split and the amount of energy being produced. You don't want to melt the reactor and go from there. And once the chain reaction is gone to a process that is enough to sustain it, that's called the reactor has gone critical. So it's at a point where it doesn't need any external impetus to go ahead and to get that. It's already good to go. So uranium is non-stable, so it's constantly radioactive and releasing energy. And it's, if you find it in the real world, its radioactivity is very low because it has a very long half-life, 704 million years before half of the radioactivity is gone. So that's, good thing for natural uranium, but bombarded radiation, or sorry, uranium means we've done a lot, we've monkeyed around with it, so its half-life looks very different. It's also interesting too, it's very, very dense. It's 70% more dense than lead, but not quite as dense as gold. Gold is very precious. Depleted uranium is not. And so you worry about armor-piercing bullets. And so if you have depleted uranium bullets, they are so dense, you just have to propel them at a high rate of speed, and then they can penetrate very strong, very challenging things because it's a very dense object, means you can accelerate it. It's got a lot of energy for a very small area, so they can go very far and penetrate many different materials. So you've got to enrich the uranium because we can't just take uranium out of the ground, mine it, and throw it in a reactor. We got to process it. We want to process it to what we would call a low enriched value, which is typically of the uranium that's in the bundle. About 3 to 5% of that is U-235. That is the typical amount for commercial reactors. But you're not worried about space. You can have a lot of room for these reactors, and so 3 to 5% is plenty. We'll just have more physical fuel in there, and it's not a problem because we have lots and lots of room. Highly enriched uranium is greater than 85%, and that's considered weapons grade. So you have a very small footprint, and it has a lot of capability to split atoms in a very small space. So that's when you can get into nuclear weapons. Or you can also do fuel for submarine. As one can imagine, you don't have an infinite amount of room to fuel on a submarine. You're trying to make these as small and as nimble as possible. So in submarines or even in aircraft carriers, you have very, very highly enriched radioactive, or sorry, spent uranium fuel, which is always interesting to me because if you see a lot of people that will protest nuclear facilities, they will be protesting, nuclear reactor. But if you were to go to where you would see aircraft carriers that are docked or submarines, the newer submarines, not the older ones that were diesel fueled, but the new ones that are fueled with nuclear reactors, you actually have essentially a weapons grade material. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to explode and do other problems, but it's much more dangerous if, things happen than at a commercial reactor. And I thought this was really interesting because I used to really enjoy a Diet Coke. And so this is approximately to scale a 12-ounce can of Diet Coke. And if you had 1 pound of submarine fuel, so that's enriched uranium, so highly enriched uranium, you have about 1 million gallons of gasoline. But interestingly enough, 15 pounds of uranium, of enriched uranium, fits into a 12-ounce soda can. So in the case of a 12-ounce soda can, you would have the equivalent energy of about 15 million gallons of gasoline. So if you think about energy density, just massive, massive amounts of energy density when you compare to a fossil fuel. So we went and talked about this, but depleted uranium isn't very radioactive. Again, it has a very long shelf life, but it hasn't been bombarded and it's not releasing lots and lots of atoms because it's unstable. So it's not radioactive, but it is very, very dense. And so you have to worry about proliferation of uranium that has been spent. You can't just leave it around because people could make armor-piercing bullets, and that can make things very, very difficult for the protection of militaries and that type of thing. So you still, even with the spent fuel, it has to be controlled and maintained, or else you can get into some real issues there. Here's a uranium mine. It's the largest in the world. It's the Cigar Lake mine in Canada, and it's owned by Cameco. And I included this picture just to get a sense. Anytime you're doing mining, anytime you're changing things from nature, you can see it's not the prettiest impact on the facility. You can see lots and lots of digging and dirt. And so, yeah, this is not the prettiest thing. You've got some retention ponds over here for some of the water that has gone through the mining process, and so not very clean. But if you were to go and look at some of the refineries in Texas, and I say Texas not to put Texas down, that's where I've worked on refineries, or worked at refineries, I should say. They look very similar to this. Or if you were to figure out where they put mines, not mines, but wells to drill for fossil fuels, you can see that those areas get pretty dangerous. And that's one of the biggest things about the whole process of fracking. There's tremendous, tremendous amount of water resources that are used, and that water that comes back up is contaminated. And so figuring out how to treat that water has become a real difficult thing to do. So we talked about the moderator, and the moderator's purpose is it's got to slow down the neutrons as they are released, and that energy would be lost. You'd have a less efficient reactor. So the moderator, its purpose is to slow it down. Just make sure that those neutrons aren't essentially lost. And there's a few different types of moderators. We in the US use light water, which is very, very clean water with some boron added in to help it. And the neutrons are just absorbed by the water, no problem. In Canada, they use heavy water reactors where they use deuterium to make it a more efficient process. And with the deuterium, the neutrons aren't absorbed by the water. So you get more energy out that you can convert to electricity than in a light water reactor. There is a downside to that, though, and it doesn't require enriched uranium. So you can just take regular old uranium out of the ground and pull it into pellet size and actually get nuclear fuel. But it does enrich uranium. So you can put uranium into a reactor and out comes plutonium, which is much more dangerous to deal with in terms of nuclear proliferation. Graphite doesn't have that problem. It's very, very efficient. Doesn't enrich uranium, but there's a huge problem with graphite. And if graphite gets too hot, it can ignite just on exposure to air. And for those of you who aren't aware, that's what happened at Chernobyl. They had very, very large reactors, much larger than the ones you see in the US. The biggest ones in the US, I think their megawatt output for electricity, 13, maybe all the way up to 1,400 megawatts, but that's about it. The ones in Chernobyl, and again, these were built in the 70s, those were 2,000 megawatts, so much, much higher than any of the technology that we even have today in the US. And so they couldn't get the energy out with a sufficient size, and so they used graphite. Graphite is a great conductor of heat, so they would use graphite. But what happened in Chernobyl is it got too hot because of some misread meter readings, and it ignited. And once there was a fire, it was impossible to stop. And so that's the advantage of using water, because you cannot have a fire, right? Reactors can't burn in a traditional sense because they're completely encapsulated in water. So the fuel actually never catches on fire unless it's exposed to air. So generation of electricity. So you can see where the generation of electricity is. In New England, we used to have a lot more. We are down to 3 nuclear power plants. We have 2 at Millstone in Connecticut, which is just outside Niantic, and 1 in New Hampshire at Seabrook, and that's it. I think the one that closed most recently was VY Vermont Yankee, but there's none other than those 3. But you start to go see south, you got a lot more down in the south. And Texas has a few. California still has a few. They had talked about closing California, the Diablo Canyon, but then they realized that might not necessarily have been the best decision that they wanted to. So you can see that that didn't necessarily move forward from there. Florida has some. And the interesting part is in Vogtle, which is South Carolina, and in Georgia, those are, excuse me, they're talking about building very large reactors. So the ones in South Carolina are not moving forward, but they just started up a one in Georgia, I think in 2023 or 2024, and they're proposing to start one up. The other one in Georgia is going to be 2 units there that are brand new, built within the past 5 or so years, that are using different technology. So they are being built in the US, but not to the level you see in Europe. Here are the worldwide power plants. There are about 440 nuclear power plants in 31 countries, producing about 11% of the electricity. And so you can see where the nuclear power plants tend to be located. Usually they're in very stable countries, and not to put down any country that is not supporting a nuclear power plant, but you would want to make sure that the governments are stable, that people can't get in and access this spent fuel, because you can cause lots and lots of issues. Here is the numbers for nuclear power plants. So you can see the US has the most at 93. Then it's France. France, approximately 97 or 90 something percent of their power comes from nuclear power plants. They're not necessarily a natural resource rich country, so they have most of their power from nuclear. China is a big one. China used to use a lot more coal, but they've since evolved and are now using a lot more nuclear. Russia, Japan makes sense. They use a lot of technology. Even with happening in Fukushima, they still heavily rely on that. South Korea does quite a bit as well. And then you start to go down quite a bit from there. So you can get a sense of the different nuclear reactors that are there. So how do you generate electricity? So you've got our moderator, that is water, and it is absorbing heat by slowing the neutrons. And you have 2 different designs. We already talked a little bit about a pressurized water reactor. So the moderator, that's the primary, it's running at 2250 psi. Then you run it through a heat exchanger, which has a secondary system, and that is dropping the pressure down at about 950 or so psig. The water flashes to steam via those generators, and the temperature is about approximately 540 degrees. And so for our friends who really enjoy thermodynamics, this is what's called saturated temperatures. So the steam coming out of these nuclear facilities tends to be a little bit wet. So there's some additional stuff with moisture separators and reheaters that you need to do before you start running them through the turbines so that you don't damage them. A boiling water reactor operates on the same principle, having a nuclear reactor with a moderator. The difference is there's no secondary system. The moderator is directly sent to the steam turbines. And so as a result, you have a much larger footprint for radioactive material, but you can design systems pretty well that do that. In either case, you have a steam turbine that is mechanically coupled to an electric generator. So the steam turbine runs at 1800 RPM, 3600 RPM, whatever you desire. That's typical speeds that you would see. And then the rotation of that generator, so you have wires and a magnetic field inside of another set of wires, and you've got a changing magnetic field that's cut by a closed loop, and then you produce electricity. Typical sizes, 1600 megawatts to 1300 megawatts. Again, this is in the US primarily. So here's a pressurized water reactor. We can see that we have our reactor with our control rods. Our pressurizer maintains the pressure of the reactor at a certain point. Our reactor coolant pumps are what circulate the water in through the steam generator. You have clean water, but not radioactive water, that heads out to the turbine, which is mechanically coupled to the generator. And then the generator goes and feeds transmission lines. So you're stepped up in voltage, and then that goes and distributes the load. The condenser, you have to take that steam all the way back to water. So you have to cool it down a little bit. And so that's why we need those cooling towers that we saw earlier. Then you have a condensate pump that sends the water back to the steam generators, and the process rinse and repeats. It's a completely closed loop system. And interestingly enough, the in this pressurized water reactor, you have to have two failed systems before you release any radiation to the outside world, because you have to have the condensate heat exchanger fail before you actually start getting radioactive material out there. So you'd have to have, not only would you have to have the steam generator, but you'd also need to have the condensate, the condenser heat exchanger have some failures. In a BWR, you just take basically the system, get rid of the pressurizer as well as the steam generators. You have the same process here, but now you have to have a lot more monitoring because you only have one system that has the possibility of failing before you can send some radioactive material out into the environment. But in terms of just the general design, they're very, very similar. So let's talk technology, which is generation 2, which is really old technology, but they're all light water reactors. They have control rods that contain boron, and they shut down the reactor. They have tons and tons of automated control systems because humans, when we get comfortable doing things, we sort of take corners. It's not a put down on anybody, but it's just how things are. And you have these automated systems that are sitting there continuously monitoring the systems, and will take and provide some sort of safety actuation. So if you have a pressure drop, that's called safety injection. And so these systems will automatically start to dump in boronated water into the reactor to kind of stop any kind of chain reaction that's occurring. Containment isolation, I'm monitoring the air inside containment. So if I'm getting high radioactive levels, that means that something has broken free, and I don't know why, but I have to shut down all the air that's coming in and out of containment. So I would isolate it. You don't want these systems to operate by mistake. And so you have to have very, very high reliability. And so they have trains and channels where you have, you have sort of a voting, if you will. So that's why it's 1 out of 2. So you have 2 separate monitoring devices, and any one of those 2 can start the process of tripping, but then you need another channel or another train. So that's a 1 out of 2, and then you need another 1 out of 2. That's a take and replace part to go ahead and actually issue some sort of engineered safeguards operation. You could also have 4 monitoring devices, and any 2 out of those 4 could go ahead and cause an actuation. And the reason why you always need 2 devices to operate is because one device can fail. That's accepted. But the likelihood of 2 devices failing within close proximity to each other is way less likely. So if you were to look at the statistical analysis of that, that's very unlikely to occur. So a lot of safeguards, a lot of design there. The biggest downside of the current US technology is you need lots of emergency on-site generation. And so for those of you who recall the Fukushima problem, it was a massive wave that took out the facility. And what I mean by take out the facility, water just swamped the facility. But inside containment, the reactors were still in one piece. They were still fine. There was no way of operating things because they obviously had swamped a lot of the systems, but nothing had happened. And what the bad thing was, these emergency generators they had that would remove the heat from the reactors once they were shut down, those generators were swamped with water, so they were inoperable. And unfortunately, what ended up happening is that when those were swamped, that the government in Japan didn't respond fast enough. And I'm not saying they could have done anything differently because it was such a human catastrophe. It was really hard to respond to. But because they couldn't respond and get some sort of emergency power generation there, that after 3-4 days, the reactors had heated up because they hadn't been able to reject heat into the environment, that they actually ended up having reactor core meltdowns. And then now they have a real serious problem with lots and lots of cleanup. So because they weren't able to get and resolve things quickly, you actually exacerbated the problem. And each of these on-site generators, remember, any system can fail. So you have 2 separate trains, and either one of those trains is what can bring the plant down to what's called a hot shutdown. So basically meaning it's safe to start to do some work in there. You don't need both, you just need one. So again, that's the kind of the level of design. And these trains are very well designed. They're not supposed to be located in the same room. No cables can run in the same room because if a fire occurs in one room, it could possibly take out the other system. So you have to have physical separation and isolation to get to be very, very complicated. Since those are the ones that we've been using for the longest, there's the most commercial familiarization with those, we've learned a lot. So if you were to go to 3 Mile Island, which is in Pennsylvania, this is back in the 70s, and they actually had a complete core meltdown for Unit 2. Again, they did not believe devices, they ignored them. So the core melted down, and interestingly enough, that's a 2-unit facility. Unit 1, which is adjacent essentially to Unit 2, is still operating. So even though Unit 2 had a complete core meltdown, it did not get any radiation release in the environment. So there was no issues that containment did what it was supposed to do. The difficulty, though, was when they had designed these systems, they hadn't considered that there might be elevated levels of hydrogen inside the reactor, because when you heat up water to certain levels, it's possible that you can separate the hydrogen and the oxygen molecules, and then you can have buildup of hydrogen, which means you could have explosion. You could have an explosion with just vibration. It's that unstable, and with certain concentrations. You also had very, very high levels of radiation that they couldn't monitor with their equipment that they were using because it was unexpected and unexpectedly high. They didn't anticipate that. So all the newer plants and all the existing plants had to be designed with some of those TMI 3 Mile Island modifications. There was also a huge fire at Unit 1 at Browns Ferry that almost caused a meltdown, but they were able to actually get it back. And so this is when they said, let's add another backup system, because even though we have 2 redundant trains, which are supposed to be physically isolated, it's not possible to be perfect. So we'll add a 3rd train, which is a lot more limited, but still gives us the ability to shut things down. And you're still building these in China. Very, very inexpensive to build, very quick to build, work very, very well. Here are some of the new reactors, and I thought this slide was really fascinating, but you can take a look at the different color schemes, and you can see orange is where they're being built. You will note that there are 2 here in the US, right? And really that should be 1 now, because we have the one in Georgia that's already operational. You also will see that there were 2 that were abandoned. These are the ones in South Carolina. They stopped building them. You can see the reactors that have been closed. So these have all shut down in the last 20 years or so. And then prior to that, these purple ones were the ones that they were starting to build, but then they became abandoned. And so those are the ones in the US. You can take a look in the world, and you can see a lot of development happening over here in Asia. So you can see some work being over here. So looking for the orange boxes, you can see a fair amount of construction going on in there. Not too much happening in Europe, but you get a sense of where they are getting built. So Generation 3, been around for quite a few years, right? Over 30 plus years-ish, if you will. So they've been built in 1996, has a better fuel design. So this unvoided air entrapped coolant. So you can optimize the fuel moderation, meaning it's more efficient, which means you have more efficient capture of heat, which also means you might be able to make it work without any engineered safeguards requiring emergency on-site power. So you can just rely on natural circulation, just the way things are designed naturally, where you heat things up, you have less density, they float up above, and then the cool stuff is more dense, and then you actually go to the bottom, and then that's how you can get some cool. Also, and this is kind of laughable for today's technology, but fully digital control was a big deal in the 90s because you don't have the processing power that you do today. And so having digital control has been around for many, many years. But this was revolutionary because doing things in a nuclear world, everybody is so afraid, it just takes an extremely long period of time before things can get sort of implemented and approved. And the last bullet here, last major bullet, and this is a huge one, is that the NRC has already gone through and extensively reviewed the design and said, yes, this is an adequate design. So you can build the power plant without any additional approvals from the NRC, at least in terms of the reactor side of the house. So you're looking to improve the time it takes to build these plants, because you're talking 4, sometimes 7 to 10 years. If you could take out some of the design time that's necessary, you can really simplify construction substantially. Here are some of those reactors that were built in China. So this is just a Google Map image of units 5 and 6. They're in China. They're Generation 3 reactors, and they're both designed for 1,000 megawatts electric. So again, many of these are being built in Asia. So here, kind of shows the inside. It's a PWR, so it's pressurized water reactor, and this is just this HPR 1000, which you can see it has passive cavity injection, which means you just have a tank at a high enough level that when you have a break, excuse me, inside the reactor, gravity is going to just start to result in the water being pushed in there. You do have some active cavity injection here and active safety injection if you wanted to make it happen a little faster, but you have some of these large tanks over here that are storing water and are available to just start to dump water at a slow pace. You also have passive heat containment. So you have water that is located outside the reactor, and it's basically a heat exchanger. So as the water goes up, it's heated, it runs into this cooler surface that is exposed to the environment through a heat exchanger. It cools down, and then it completes the process over. You can see there's also some feed water pools. So again, this is just put in place if you wanted to speed up the process, because you do have power on site. You can do a lot of this stuff much, much faster. So the next generation of reactors, which is pretty much been designed for today, but nothing that I know of has been built. It's not going to necessarily improve what's going to happen in terms of efficiency of the reactor. It's actually going to improve what happens with that spent fuel. That is the biggest problem with reactors. So there's 2 types of waste, and we'll get more involved or more discussion with what's high level and what's low level. But the high level is the very dangerous stuff, and that will be spent in decades. That'll go away in 50 years. It will no longer be considered high level. It won't take thousands of years to go ahead and treat that. They'll be slightly more efficient, but not super efficient. Interestingly enough, they can consume spent nuclear fuel. So if you were to go to all the generators around the US, they still have their spent fuel on site. So all that spent fuel could be collected and could be sent to a Generation 4 reactor, and then actually would consume that fuel because there still is energy available in there. Highly unlikely that that's going to change. There was a law signed by President Carter in 1977, which precluded reprocessing, which I think is unfortunate at this point. France has been reprocessing their fuel for many, many years and hasn't had any issues. Also, another really nice thing is you can generate heat from these reactors. So there's an excessive amount of heat, and it's a high quality heat, which means you can actually get hydrogen. So instead of needing to do fossil fuels, you can have hydrogen powered vehicles, perhaps. So you can go ahead and do that. And there are 6 different ones being developed. Here's sort of the through time. So you can see back in 1950, early prototypes, all the way through 2090, which is our 4th generation. And you can see the different type of reactors that are doing it. But look at the different types. The moderators are no longer going to be water, except for this super cooled salt, lead, gas cooled, just very different reactor moderator designs. If you've been paying attention to the news a little bit, you might have been hearing about China and what they're doing with thorium reactors and doing some research. It isn't new technology at all. It was first discovered, I should say, in 1940, but actually shown in a research reactor in 1965. It actually was used to generate electricity for about 5 years and produced over 2 billion kilowatt hours. It's still a plain old reactor that performs nuclear fission of U-233, so a slightly different type of uranium, not 235, but 233. But they use thorium as a fuel, and the thorium is converted to uranium through the process. Why is it better to go thorium? Because it's much more readily abundant thorium than uranium. It's less likely to have any proliferation because, again, you're using thorium, so it's spent fuel is not as much of a problem. And there is less waste production per unit of generation. So huge, huge advantages to going with thorium. Why we haven't looked at that, again, we get sort of, it's human nature. We're comfortable with certain things and we don't want to change it. So maybe at some point they'll start looking at thorium, but at this point, to the best of my knowledge, there isn't anything there. So as we talked about, the NRC is responsible for the licensing, granting of the licenses, or basically handing you the keys to your plant, and then making sure that you are designing and operating and maintaining your plant in accordance with the license. It is a very, very, very extensive review process. Takes many years to get a license approved. So it takes a lot of work. That also requires an almost ideal environmental situation, not too close to fault lines, not too close to an airport that something could be dropped and damage the containment. Not in an unstable area. It takes all kinds of different issues to be mediated out. It could take at least 3 years, maybe even longer. If you have protesters, they can go to court and they can make things very, very difficult. The NRC has tried for many years to get a general permit that can't be challenged in court, but that hasn't been successful and may or may not ever be successful. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not an attorney, and I don't pretend to be one, so I don't know if this will ever be viable or not. So last couple things we'll talk about, which is radioactive waste and what happens. So radiation has different effects on the body depending upon where it comes into contact. So we have alpha, beta, gamma, neutron, different types of radiation that we see. And if you think about it, the skin is a great shield against radiation. If not, we would be stepping out of the sun and then we get sick immediately. So the sun is producing lots and lots of radiation. That's why in the summertime, you put sunblock on your skin, or you stand under an umbrella, or you wear those SPF 50 shirts or whatever they're called. And the idea is that they absorb the radiation. Your skin, the outer layers of your skin is no longer a live skin. So it doesn't hurt that typical skin or that type of skin to be, to absorb some radiation. Continued exposure will result in damage, and that's when you get a sunburn. But the problem becomes when you have these energized particles, they're moving at a fairly high rate of speed, and they come into contact with a living cell, and it can damage that cell or it can kill the cell. And as long as you don't kill too many cells, that's not a problem. The issue becomes when you mutate the cell. And if you have too many mutating cells, they are not necessarily doing their job of building an organ in your body or something like that. And so that's the cancer. And so that's the most prevalent one with radiation is cancer because of the mutation that results from the damage of the radiation. And the NRC provides guidelines depending on what you're going to be exposed to. So your skin obviously can be exposed to more radiation because it does all the time. But if you were to ingest some radioactive material, if you were to take a breath of something and there's some radioactive material in the air, your lungs do not have that same level of protection. And so the exposure to radiation inside your lungs is far more dangerous than being on your skin. And so the limits there look very, very different. The low-level waste and high-level waste, the discussion there. Low-level waste is you've got waste that is, very lightly radioactive. It might be that, a piece of something in the fuel has broken off. It's very, very small, and it gives off a small amount of radiation. So it might be something that has been giving off radiation for a long period of time, and it's just is really well into its, half-life years, if you will. So it has a reasonable half-life. And so what they do with low-level waste, they collect it at these commercial facilities and they compress it as much as they can. They try to get it into as small a package as possible, and then they landfill it. They don't try to treat it because it's almost impossible to treat. Over time, it will become no longer radioactive. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a problem, because if you can get some of this low-level waste, you could create what's called a dirty bomb. And so a dirty bomb is just a regular explosive device that is packed inside of some low-level radioactive material. Somebody who's trying to cause problems could bring a bomb like that and it's not super radioactive, they are getting some damage. But what they're doing is they ignite the bomb and then it spreads this radioactive material over a very large area. And then the cleanup for that would take a lot of effort and time to do that. So that renders those areas potentially inhospitable. But you can go to hospitals in Bangor, for example, that use radioactive isotopes and some equipment, and they even treat patients with it for cancer. And you can find that material there. So that would be considered low-level waste. The high-level waste is all spent fuel. That's the only thing that quantifies as high-level waste. It has a very long half-life and very short-term exposure can result in death. I once talked to somebody, and I don't know how true this is, but the thing was if you put high-level radioactive waste, so spent fuel, you put it at the end of a football field, and you start on the other end, and it would said by the time you get to the 50-yard line, you would probably no longer be alive. That's how much energy is released, causing you some issues there. So we had these nuclear power plants that have been operating for many, many years. Great. So now we have all the spent fuel. What do we do with it? Well, once it's been outside the reactor for a little while, it doesn't take long for that high level waste to be not as radioactive or not as physically warm. And so what you do is you put it in these casks, these dry level casks, these dry casks, which basically you can see the spent fuel in the center. Then you wrap that around in a canister to kind of keep some of the radiation from really getting out in the environment. Then you wrap that in concrete and you have some air vents to allow the canister to stay cool. So you don't want it to overheat because again, it's continuing to have radiation being emitted. But it doesn't actually cause the canister to get so hot that it melts. And so you just rely on natural circulation. And these concrete casks are very large. They're massive. So they're hard to move. They're also well protected, from a security standpoint. But even then, they're so well designed, it would take a lot to go ahead and actually damage that. So you could actually ship these concrete casks into different locations if a repository for spent fuel ever gets built. So here are the sites where you can find nuclear waste. This would be high and low level waste. And you can see in Maine, in the Wiscasset area, that's where Maine Yankee is. That's where they have the spent fuel. And then again, it's almost every state has some spent fuel or has some low level waste. Yucca Mountain, which is in the center in Nevada, you can see that that is proposed to be the long-term storage of the spent level fuel, but it has never been allowed to actually store some. It may never be. That's the difficulty with the spent fuel is you have to have something that is viable for millennia. And you can understand why some of these governments do not want you to put their spent fuel in their state because in 50 years or 100 years or 1,000 years, the topography of the area might look very different. And now you have this inhospitable land because people have been dumping their spent fuel there. So it is a real issue to figure out what to do. And I don't know if there'll ever be an answer. Maybe not in my lifetime, I'm uncertain. And here's our last slide. So what's the future? So nuclear energy has about 100 years to go for a traditional reactor. If we use next generation reactor, we have thousands of years of fuel available with dispatchable sources. Got to be very careful about proliferation because the bad people getting their hands on this stuff can cause real issues to us. Our new reactor designs have to be able to incorporate rapid changes in power. So as renewables go up and down in output, their nuclear power plants have to figure out a way to balance those out. And that's primarily because a lot of the US is what's called deregulated. So the generation and the transmission cannot be owned by the same group of people. So if you want to compete in an open market, you better be able to have a lot of options available to you. And those are going to be very similar to the reactors we talked about on submarines or on aircraft carriers. And then the last thing is, how do you mitigate the risk? How do you stop projects from really causing lots and lots of issues? And the ones that were in South Carolina and Georgia, those are the ones that were recently built. Siemens had to file bankruptcy because they had a fixed price contract to build these facilities. They had a lot of experience building in Asia, And then they came to the US and created, there were a lot of problems that caused us some issues there. So it really got stuck with what was happening. So that was my last slide. I hope you found this discussion interesting and also hopefully gives you a little bit of food for thought about what are possible options for helping to figure out what our future energy mix is going to be. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and I wish you a great day. Take care.